The American speechwriter James Hume said, "The art of communication is the language of leadership." Back in the late January, when China was still enjoying the new year, coronavirus was first reported in Wuhan City and then quickly concerned most Chinese employers due to its fast spreading. The Chinese government then asked its citizens to stay home and work remotely. The sudden change in work mode requires Chinese companies to adapt quickly by demonstrating crisis leadership and overcoming many communication challenges caused by the change. Hello, everyone. This is Veronica Guo, an assistant professor and communication scholar with the Department of Business Communication at Marshall School of Business. Today, I will talk about how the coronavirus impacts communication within organizations in China and in the US, especially in their long distance communication and leadership communication. So now let's move to the first study, team communication in remote work. Remote work is common in most global companies, especially in the US workplace. According to the employee benefits reports published in 2017 and 19 by the Society for Human Resources Management, the number of remote workers in the US has increased from 60% to 69%. Ad hoc and telecommunicating benefits are a typical package seen in the American job market. However, remote work is not familiar to many Chinese business practitioners as it is to Americans. This work mode can be particularly challenging for non-global or domestic companies in China, such as the state-owned, private companies, and government departments, especially in a global crisis when no prior preparation and support is provided. So we were wondering, how did remote work affect team communication in the Chinese domestic companies? Is there any difficulties? The change was very abrupt to many Chinese companies, like I said. Before coronavirus, only global companies and some large-scale Chinese corporates are sort of used to remote work due to their high percentage of virtual teams. Most Chinese state-owned and private companies had never practiced remote work as a routine. If they didn't have prior experiences of remote work and working as virtual teams, it could be very difficult for them to adapt. Studies show that remote work required both leaders and employees to overcome many challenges, among which communication, trust, and productivity become the three main issues. First, communication challenges relationship building and cultural building in a virtual setting. China is known as a collectivistic, high power distance, and high context culture. A large body of studies has reviewed the communication patterns in typical Chinese companies, such as communal, relational-based, hierarchical, indirect, close social interaction, and interdependence. We found in our current data that it became very difficult for our participants to sense the changing team rules and culture. They had to learn very quickly by testing the water or breaking the rules. Previously established workplace norms were broken and changed as they adapted to the new work mode. They had to think more carefully to draft their messages via the internet, be more organized in the virtual team meetings to avoid potential doubt on their work ethics. Relatedly, trust then becomes a critical issue while face-to-face communication was reduced. Trust has been treated as a static concept in the past studies. While it could be fluid as an ongoing process, studies also reported some typical worries like coworkers to badmouth behind their backs, make changes to projects without telling them in advance, lobby against them, and leaders don't fight for their priorities. Team trust is threatened in the sudden change of work mode. So problems like low commitment, procrastination, and burnout would emerge with low team trust. Remote work also posed high requirements for corporate infrastructure support and leaders' capability to manage computer-mediated communication via various technologies. These companies face very few options for communication and work approaches at the beginning of the coronavirus. They had to adapt by searching for resources, evaluating available options, and confronting with communication challenges by relying on the trust established previously. We observed that most leaders in our study encountered a very high level of uncertainty, which is reflected in their greater control of their work progress, high demand for task details, and control of their employees' online presence. Due to the reduced face-to-face communication, virtual meetings became inevitable and more frequent. The meeting time was reported longer than they were before the coronavirus. Some leaders started to check on their employees via communication technologies every 3 hours. Some others would call on their employees frequently in the WeChat group or via phone calls. Therefore, employees reported a lack of trust at the beginning of the pandemic. Most participants explained their anxiety about being monitored too closely when working from home. Meanwhile, employees faced challenges in managing work-life balance that might affect productivity. Previously, scholars have discovered work-life balance as employees try to negotiate the boundaries between the work and family settings. Now, employees in our interviews had to manage the identity switch at home to avoid role referencing, defined as a process of work role overlapping with the family roles. Due to the frequent virtual meetings, they could not conduct their family errands as scheduled. People who missed meetings due to family obligations were not fully accommodated. When the leaders did not take actions immediately to communicate support, employees felt disappointed towards the team and the company, which potentially led to distrust. Meanwhile, their stay at home frequently was deemed as paid vacation by their family members, which posed challenges to their productivity and relationship maintenance within the family. They had to take various communication strategies to manage the role referencing and role identity switch in family conflicts. So you may wonder, in addition to difficulties, is there any benefits? Interestingly enough, some companies engaged in smooth adaptation to remote work by taking a goal-oriented approach. The leadership communicated frequently about the latest updates of company business and set up clear timelines for teams. In addition to formal communication platforms, many teams engaged in social media to maintain team cohesion. We found this is particularly interesting because social media accommodated the function of identity building in remote work, which is rare to see in the relevant studies based in Western workplace or before coronavirus in the Chinese work setting. So after talking about the Chinese organization, let's talk about the second study that is more about the US work setting, leadership and sense-making. The second study is looking at how corporate leadership communicates coronavirus to employees here in the US-based companies, and more importantly, how employees interpret the corporate communication of crisis. Coronavirus is a global health crisis that greatly impacts organizational operation in various aspects. As we can see from the media report in the early February, more and more confirmed cases in the US led to questions and doubts. What did coronavirus mean to our business? Are we safe at work? Do we need to reduce our social distancing? Is it good enough by following good respiratory hygiene? While at the national level, the general public was confused by unclear, or conflicting messaging. We wonder if it's the same at the corporate level, because internal communication is still essential to organizational success. Corporate communication is linked to organizational performance, productivity, organizational identity, and organizational culture. Paradoxically, internal communication can also pose a threat to organizational relationships, as poor communication can be counterproductive. Past studies reveal that employees are more likely to experience a high level of uncertainty and ambiguity in crisis, which requires more effective corporate communication strategies. So we are taking two theoretical concepts here in our study. The two keywords are sense-making and sense-giving. In our research, we believe that uncertainty and ambiguity in coronavirus defy interpretation and impose severe demands on employees' sense-making. In other words, searching for meaning. Weick 1988 and 1983 pointed out that sense-making is an active process of seeking information and interpreting the situation that is comprehended explicitly in words, and that serves as a springboard into action. An inadequate sense-making process at a crisis is more likely to lead to diverged discourses, ways of thinking, and anxiety, which potentially leads to distrust for the management. Studies show that effective corporate leadership communication should encourage actively seeking and sharing valuable, positive information across organizational boundaries, which is defined as employee sense-making process. Meanwhile, the corporate leader's interpretation and articulation of the current situation is seen as sense-giving, articulating their interpretation in a comprehensible manner to influence others. When employees' sense-making processes are impeded by misalignment between an organization and employees, corporate communication activities during a crisis are often misinterpreted, resisted, or rejected by employees. We could consider this process as a failure of sense-giving. So why does sense-giving and sense-making matter in corporate communication with their employees? Stratberger et al. 2016 emphasized the importance of communication with employees during the crisis by suggesting active communication makes employees feel well-informed and confident during a crisis. But only a few studies take the upward approach to learn from their employees. Employees are like neurons in a nerve system that transmits information, generating both internal and external impacts through various kinds of social networks. They exchange ideas to make sense of the impacts of coronavirus and create an organizational discourse of what's going on. Sense-making processes can also be influenced by others' communication behaviors. So employees can also talk to their clients, friends, family members to compare and contrast, then make sense of their own companies. In a company, employees can engage in voluntary information forwarding behaviors. They are considered as boundary spanners by scholars because they collect valuable information for their organization, sharing the data and building support networks internally and externally. More importantly, employees who are more active than others will select and circulate selected information to mobilize attention, legitimacy, and resources toward their problem solving, which then eventually shape the organizational discourse. In this sense, the role of strategic sense-giving is vital in crisis situations where there is a high level of communication ambiguity and a strong need for sense-making. Corporate leaders may aggravate the impact of the crisis through poor communications and create delusion, distrust, and cynicism among the employees. Therefore, effective sense giving and reduces uncertainty and ambiguity by filling the communication gap between management and employees. More importantly, effective corporate leadership communication can guide employees' interpretation of the global crisis. Appropriate communication that conveys corporate responsibility can establish a very strong organizational culture and lead to employees' strong organizational identification. So we look forward to finding out how employees interpret leadership communication of coronavirus and how the communication of coronavirus impacts their perceptions toward their own companies. That's all about my studies. Thank you very much for listening.